Hey everyone, it's Blake here with ChessPathways.com, and today we're going to be talking about the Queen's Gambit, one of the most popular opening systems in chess. So the Queen's Gambit begins with d4, it's a queen's pawn opening, and when black plays d5, white plays c4, the most popular move in this position by far, adding more pressure on that black center and fighting for more space. Now you can tell by the name, Gambit, that it's a pawn sacrifice, and indeed black can at least temporarily win a pawn here by capturing on c4, but this is considered a very safe pawn sacrifice to make. It will be very difficult for black to just hold on to that extra pawn if they choose to take, and we're going to take a look at that in this video. So black has a couple ways to play here. They can choose to decline the gambit. Playing e6 is the Queen's Gambit declined, just reinforcing this pawn. c6 is another way to do it, that's called the Slav Defense. Black can certainly accept the pawn sacrifice. Taking on c4 is called the Queen's Gambit accepted. And then black also has a couple other possibilities where they neither take on c4 nor reinforce this pawn with a pawn, and we'll take a look at that at the end of this video as well. So let's start off with the Queen's Gambit declined. What if black plays e6 and just reinforces this pawn? This concedes a space advantage to white for the time being, but black's position is certainly very solid, so let's take a look at how the game can progress. Let's say white plays knight c3, developing another piece. Black plays knight to f6. One of white's lines here is to play bishop g5, getting this bishop outside the pawn chain before white plays e3, so as not to block the bishop in. And it also pins this knight for the time being. And when black breaks that pin and plays bishop e7, now white can play e3 and defend that c4 pawn finally. Now castles. Knight to f3, very normal developing moves for both sides. Knight b to d7, black goes ahead and reinforces that other knight. You could play knight c6, but that blocks in the c-pawn, and black might want to make use of this c-pawn later, pushing it to c6 or c5. And here white's most popular move is rook to c1. And we see another advantage of getting this c-pawn involved early and not blocking it here on c2. It gives a very natural potential open file for the rook. Oftentimes when all the pawns remain on the board, it's hard to get the rooks involved because there's no open files. But now whenever white wants to, white's going to be able to exchange off the c-pawn for the d-pawn potentially later, and open this file for the rook. So in a lot of these Queen's Gambit declined positions, white gets an advantage that's small but long-lasting. White definitely has the more pleasant position here. Black has this bad light-squared bishop locked in by their own pawns that they're going to have to deal with. Whereas white succeeded in getting their bishop outside the pawn chain, white can naturally finish development with something like bishop d3 and castles, and white has a slight space advantage in the center with their two pawns against one. But at the same time, black's position is very solid and hard to break down. In some lines of the Queen's Gambit decline, black has ideas like playing knight e4 to try to initiate some exchanges, or fianchettoing this bishop with b6 at various moments, depending on the line they choose, to try to equalize the game. So those are some of the main continuations after e6 and the Queen's Gambit declined. There's also a couple possibilities both sides have to steer the game away from a normal Queen's Gambit declined position. For example, white can play g3, which is the Catalan, which is usually considered kind of a different opening altogether from the Queen's Gambit. After something like knight f6, knight f3, white's going to put this bishop on the long diagonal and castle very quickly to the king side, and that means that if black does choose to take this pawn here on c4, white's bishop can't naturally recapture that pawn. But at the same time, that will also mean that this bishop's diagonal is opened, and that bishop can be very active for white in the Catalan. Black sometimes chooses to take right now. Of course, black can also just not take and play very solidly. And after bishop g2, black sometimes plays knight to c6. And white has some other ways to try to win this pawn back. For example, queen a4 is a common move in this position. It's still not easy for black to hold on to that extra pawn, even though the bishop can't go pick it up, and this bishop has the potential to be very strong on its diagonal. So that's the Catalan, and then black also has an alternative to the mainline Queen's Gambit decline lines. For example, after knight to c3, black can choose to strike at the center right away and take away white's space advantage by playing c5, and this is called the Slav Defense. And at first it looks very desirable to take away white's space advantage, and the move is certainly safe, it's supported by the bishop, but the main disadvantage is after white exchanges pawns like this, after these two pawns come off the board sooner or later, black's going to be left with an isolated pawn here in the center. Black succeeds in even getting a space advantage in some of these lines, having the lone pawn in the center, but the d-pawn can be pretty weak. White can go after it by putting the bishop on g2 to eye this pawn, the knight's eyeing this pawn, After the d pawn gets exchanged, white can put pressure on the d file against this pawn with the rooks and the queen. If a knight comes to f6 to defend this pawn, white can try to exchange that knight away with a move like bishop g5 in some cases. But at the same time, black will have open lines for all the pieces to develop, and it's not often black can get a space advantage so early, so that's kind of the trade-off black is making when they choose the Tarrasch defense. Alright, we've covered pretty much everything that can happen after e6, the Queen's Gambit declined, including the two other openings that can occur, the Catalan with bishop g2 and the Tarrasch defense, where black plays an early c5. Now let's consider another move for black. What if black reinforces the pawn with c6? This is called the Slav defense. This has become probably the most popular way, by a small margin, to meet the Queen's Gambit with black. And at first it looks like this move isn't as good as e6. e6 opens a line for the bishop to develop, whereas this move c6 doesn't really open many natural lines of development. But here's black's idea in the Slav defense from a high level. Not only are they reinforcing their central pawn here so that if white takes, black can maintain their foothold in the center, but this move c6 also makes black's threat to take here on c4 more credible. Because, for example, in one of the lines, knight f3, knight f6, knight c3, when black takes, they're going to be ready to play b5 in some lines, and this will have a natural supporter here of the c6 pawn, forming this more solid pawn chain. And if white's not careful, it might be hard to get that pawn back on c4, because this c6 pawn helps stabilize that pawn chain with c4, b5, c6. It turns out that black's threat here to play b5 is actually so annoying for white that white's most popular move here is to play a4 and just make sure that black cannot play b5. But of course, this is kind of a concession itself. This means that white will never be able to control the b4 square, and that can often find itself home for a bishop to come pin that knight where it can't be easily kicked away by a3 anymore. Alternatively, in the Slav defense, white sometimes plays an early e3 just to make sure this pawn is defended. For example, let's look at knight f3, knight f6, and now instead of playing knight c3 and allowing d takes c4, white sometimes chooses to play e3 and just defend this pawn right away. But compared to those lines we saw in the Queen's Gambit declined, where white got this bishop outside this pawn chain, got it active here on g5, this is also kind of a concession from white. It means that white's bishop is going to be locked in here, and black has reasons to be happy there too. So by playing c6 and making this threat to the pawn more credible, black has kind of provoked white into defending it earlier on than they otherwise would have had to, and block in the white bishop here on c1. Another advantage of the Slav is it leaves this light-squared bishop open for now. It's not blocked by e6. Now black sometimes has to be careful about moving it too early, because white sometimes has ideas to play queen b3 if this bishop moves, attacking d5 and b7, and that can be trouble for black. But if white plays some non-ambitious continuation here, black sometimes succeeds in getting this bishop outside the pawn chain. And finally, I just want to briefly mention one more aspect of the Slav. After something like knight f3, knight f6, knight c3, we said black's main move here is to take on c4, but there's also the very popular option to play e6 here, and this is called the semi-Slav defense, probably because it's mixing ideas from the Queen's Gambit declined and the Slav, at least at first glance. And at first glance, you might think this is a more passive option from black, but it's actually a very complex line, definitely too complex to really get into it in this video. It would need its own video for sure. But from a high level, we can say that black's just taking one extra move to really stabilize their position, and now if white moves this bishop out of the pawn chain to f4 or g5, black really is ready to take on c4 if they want to and play b5. And if white does not do that, let's say white finally plays e3 and defends this pawn, black has ideas after some preparatory moves like knight d7 to take on c4, play b5, put the bishop on b7, and later to play c5 and blow everything open for the bishop. There's some very sharp lines with that featured in it. So playing e6 here instead of taking on c4 right away, definitely not as passive as it looks. Again, that's the semi-Slav defense. Alright, so we've covered all the possibilities after e6, the Queen's Gambit declined, and c6, which would be the Slav defense. Let's look at what happens if black accepts the sacrifice. This is the Queen's Gambit accepted. So black temporarily wins a pawn, but they gave up their control over the center. White could play e4 now if they wanted to and control the whole center. And as soon as this e-pawn moves, this bishop is going to be open on the pawn, and it's going to be really hard for black to hold onto that pawn. So usually when people play the Queen's Gambit accepted, they're not doing it with the idea to hold onto the pawn long term. They know they're going to have to give the pawn back, but they're hoping to buy some time to possibly strike at the center in the meantime. For example, if white plays e4 here, which looks like the most obvious move, just controlling the whole center and attacking that pawn, black will often play e5 right now. And if white were to take here on e5, black could exchange queens and force the king here to sit open on d1, probably not what white wants. If white plays knight f3, now black can take on d4, and white's probably going to succeed in getting both of their pawns back here. They're both very easily captured, but in the meantime, black has opened a lot of lines for his pieces to develop. His bishops are both very open now, and that's black's idea here in the Queen's Gambit accepted in a lot of these lines. White often does not play e4 for this reason. They don't play it right away because e5 is actually kind of annoying. Knight f3 is a very popular move here, just stopping e5. But now black can play knight f6 and make sure white cannot play e4, and now white usually wants to get their pawn back, so they play e3, and a common line here for black is e6, bishop takes c4, and c5. So white ended up getting that pawn back, but again, black uses the meantime to develop some pieces, open some lines, and then strike back in the center. So that's how this usually goes, the Queen's Gambit accepted. Let's just take a brief look at what happens if black does play this move with the intention of being greedy. Let's say white plays knight f3, knight f6, e3, and now black does want to defend this pawn and they play b5 instead of giving the pawn back. Now white can play a4 and try to undermine this pawn chain, and it's not very easy for black to hold it together here. Of course, they can't play a6 because there's a pin here. This a6 pawn is useless, it can't take here because the rook would be taken then. So after a4, they can try to play c6, but now after a takes b5, c takes b5, you see white's rook is very active now, and now white can play b3, and it all seems to fall apart for black. If black takes on b3, now white can take on b5, and they're going to win the b3 pawn too, and white has restored material equality, except black's position is kind of in shambles here. White definitely controls the whole center, white's developed their rook, black has almost no development, and white controls the center, so black's plan of trying to be greedy did not pay off. That's why the Queen's Gambit is considered such a safe pawn sacrifice. There's really no way black's going to hold on to that extra pawn, at least not without some added preparation like we saw in the Slav Defense. Alright, so we've looked at the Queen's Gambit declined, the Slav Defense, and the Queen's Gambit accepted. Now let's look at some of black's rarer continuations where they don't take on c4 and they don't reinforce that pawn with another pawn. One of these is playing e5, the Alban counter gambit. Now black is the one sacrificing a pawn, and white really needs to accept this pawn sacrifice because you don't want to let black just equalize all the space in the center for free. That would be a huge concession if white played a move like e3 here. So if white accepts this gambit, black usually pushes forward with d4. White's up a pawn in the meantime, but this pawn is kind of cramping white. It stops white from playing knight to c3, and black hopes they can recapture this pawn later. So for example, knight f3, knight c6, and there's many possible continuations here. I'll just show one for the purpose of this video. White's most popular move is g3, just fianchettoing this bishop and getting castled early, and the game can often go knight g to e7, bishop to g2, knight g6, black's really going after this e5 pawn, and white castles. So now black can go ahead and take that pawn if they want it with knight g takes e5, but black did have to spend a lot of moves to get that pawn back. White's already castled and black's not, so white was content to not be greedy, give the pawn back, and just finish development in this particular variation of the Alban counter gambit. Then there's this move knight f6, which at first looks very reasonable, just adding more support to this pawn and developing a piece. This move is actually a clear mistake, though. No one really takes this move seriously in high-level chess now, because white can simply now take this pawn, and black loses their grasp of the center. They can't recapture with the pawn, and no matter what black does here, they're really going to be giving up the whole center. For example, after queen takes d5, white can simply play knight c3 and probably e4 on the next turn. White's going to get the whole center. And after, for example, knight takes d5, white's also going to play e4 in the very near future, and white really has the complete center here, and black has nothing to show for it except making multiple knight moves in the opening, coming here, here, coming back. For example, after e4, knight f6, knight c3, you can play this way as black, but I certainly wouldn't recommend it. White completely controls the center, you have to watch out for e5 at some point, and white definitely has an advantage. That's why if black wants to decline the gambit, they usually do so by reinforcing with a pawn. This way, if white ever takes, this is usually going to be completely harmless because black can just take back and equalize the space in the center. Finally, I'll just briefly mention one other rare line, and that is to play knight to c6. This is the Chigorin defense, And at first it looks like this falls prey to the same problem as knight f6 did. Black did not reinforce this pawn, so why can't white just take it? But black's idea now is after queen takes d5, white's not ready to start kicking the queen away yet because now this pawn is actually under attack. Black has 2 attackers on the d4 pawn, so if white were to play knight c3, black would just win a pawn. That's not at all what white wants. So instead, white has to do a little preparation first. White usually plays e3, just defending this d4 pawn, but now black bought some time to play e5 and strike at that center. And now if white plays knight to c3, black had enough time to open up the line of development for this bishop, and usually this knight just gets pinned, with bishop e4 just stopping the knight from taking the queen that way, while black keeps on with their development. So this is certainly an interesting way to play, but it definitely has some downsides. For example, after bishop d2 here, what's black going to do? Now their queen's under attack again, and they either have to move it away or give up this nice bishop by taking on c3, and the white center is actually really solid. After b takes c3, white can try to expand later. But nonetheless, the Chigorin defense knight c6 is considered a legitimate defense to the queen's gambit. It is a rare one, but it's definitely not as bad as playing knight f6. Alright, thanks everyone for watching. Whether you play the queen's gambit as white, or whether you're a d5 player with black and you need to know how to play against the queen's gambit, I hope you learned something today. And make sure you go to chesspathways.com right now and get signed up. Only takes a couple seconds, and I will send you a free move-by-move guide to chess thinking when you join. You'll get access to all of our exclusive content and contests, and I'll make sure you never miss any new content I put out there. Thanks again for watching, and I will see you soon.